I'm Ryan Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and last month I did something that most people would call unthinkable. After 3 years of paying my parents' $800,000 mortgage, after covering their property taxes, their insurance, and even their grocery bills, they looked me dead in the eye at a family barbecue and told me that real sons don't disappoint their parents the way I do. So I walked out of that house, pulled out my phone, and canceled every single automatic payment I'd been making on their behalf. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment that changed everything happened on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in July, right there in the backyard of the very house I'd been paying for. It was supposed to be a celebration, one of those mandatory family gatherings that my mother, Linda, orchestrated with military precision. The occasion was my sister Brittany's third wedding anniversary, though calling it an anniversary felt generous considering she and her husband, Derek, had spent most of those 3 years unemployed and living in my parents' converted garage apartment. But Linda had insisted we needed to celebrate. Ted guilt-tripped me into tending with her usual arsenal of emotional manipulation about family obligations and how disappointed she'd be if I didn't show up. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, scattered like landmines across the perfectly manicured lawn that I'd been indirectly paying a landscaping service to maintain. There was the way my father Tom kept making snide comments about my girlfriend Emma not being there, how I was apparently too good to bring her around the family anymore. There was Brittany's pointed remarks about my downtown loft, how it must be nice to live in luxury while other people struggled. There was Derek's endless stream of complaints about how hard it was to find work in this economy. It's delivered with the self-righteous tone of someone who'd turned job hunting into a part-time hobby. But I'd learned to tune out the noise over the years. I developed a thick skin when it came to their passive-aggressive comments and their creative interpretations of gratitude. After all, I told myself, they were family. This was just how they communicated their stress, their frustration with their circumstances. I was the successful one, the son who'd made something of himself in tech, who pulled down a solid six-figure salary as a senior software architect at TechFlow Solutions. I could handle their little jabs and their thinly veiled resentment. What I couldn't handle, what I never saw coming, was the speech. It started innocently enough. Tom had cracked open his fourth beer of the afternoon and was holding court from his favorite lawn chair, the expensive zero-gravity recliner that I'd bought him for Father's Day 2 years earlier. Linda was bustling around the patio, playing the perfect hostess, making sure everyone's plates were full and their drinks were topped off. Brittany and Derek were sprawled on the outdoor sectional that had been my housewarming gift to my parents when they'd first moved into the Oak Valley Drive house 3 years ago. The conversation had meandered through the usual topics: the heat, the neighbors, some gossip about people I'd gone to high school with but hadn't spoken to in over a decade. I was checking my phone intermittently, half listening, when Tom suddenly cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to make an announcement. "You know," he began, his voice carrying that particular blend of beer-fueled confidence and simmering resentment that I'd come to dread, "I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to be a good son." He looked directly at me as he said it, his eyes slightly unfocused, but his intent crystal clear. "I've been thinking about responsibility, about family loyalty, about the debt that children owe to the parents who sacrificed everything for them." Linda immediately picked up the thread as if they'd rehearsed this moment. "Your father's absolutely right, Ryan. We've been talking about this a lot, actually, about how some children understand what family means and others." She trailed off, shaking her head sadly, as if she were mourning something precious that had been lost. I felt my stomach tighten, that familiar knot of anxiety that always formed when they started one of their coordinated emotional attacks. But this felt different. There was a calculated cruelty in their tone that I'd never heard before, a deliberate sharpness that cut through the humid Texas air like a blade. "What exactly are you trying to say?" I asked, setting down my untouched plate of barbecue. My voice was steady, but I could feel my pulse starting to quicken. Tom leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from disappointment to something approaching disgust. "What I'm saying, son, is that real sons don't disappoint their parents the way you do. Real sons don't act like every little thing they do for their family is some kind of burden. Real sons don't make their parents feel like beggars every time. They need help. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, then at Linda, then at Brittany and Derek, who were watching this unfold with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction. The mortgage payment that had automatically transferred from my account just 5 days earlier flashed through my mind. The $4,200 that disappeared from my checking account every month like clockwork, along with the additional $1,500 for utilities, insurance, and property taxes. The money I'd been sending without complaint, without question, without even a basic thank you for 3 solid years. Disappoint you? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded sadly, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. We raised you to be generous, Ryan. We raised you to understand that family comes first. But lately it feels like you think you're better than us, like you're doing us some kind of favor by helping out when you should understand that this is just what families do for each other. The world seemed to tilt sideways in that moment, reality reshaping itself around the words they'd just spoken. 3 years of payments. 3 years of covering their lifestyle while they criticized mine. 3 years of enabling their financial irresponsibility while they called me selfish for not doing more. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The backyard party continued around us, the Texas sun beating down mercilessly, but everything felt different now. Everything felt broken beyond repair. The irony wasn't lost on me that just 6 hours earlier, I'd been living what most people would consider a pretty enviable life. I'd woken up that Saturday morning in my downtown Austin loft. Sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lady Bird Lake. The space was everything I'd dreamed of when I was grinding. Through those brutal coding boot camp nights 5 years ago, minimalist, modern, and entirely mine. No roommates, no compromises, no one else's dirty dishes in the sink. Emma had stayed over Friday night, and we'd made breakfast together in my kitchen that still felt almost too nice to be real. She'd teased me about my obsession with perfectly aligned coffee mugs and the way I insisted on using actual cloth napkins even for weekend breakfast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was the kind of gentle ribbing that comes from someone who genuinely appreciates your quirks, rather than someone who's cataloging them as ammunition for later attacks. Emma Rodriguez was everything my family wasn't: direct, honest, and completely free of hidden agendas. She worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm downtown. And she had this refreshing way of cutting through emotional manipulation with cold, hard numbers. When I'd first started telling her about my family's financial situation, 6 months into our relationship, she'd listen without judgment, ask clarifying questions, and then delivered her assessment with the kind of straightforward clarity that had made her so successful in her career. You're essentially paying for a lifestyle your parents can't afford. She'd said, not unkindly, but without sugarcoating it either. The question isn't whether you can afford to help them. The question is whether this arrangement is actually helping anyone in the long run. But that morning, as we'd sat on my balcony drinking coffee and watching kayakers navigate the lake below, the family drama had felt manageable, distant even. Emma had plans to visit her sister in San Antonio, which meant I'd be flying solo at the family barbecue, but that had actually felt like a relief. My parents had a way of performing extra hard when Emma was around, as if they were trying to prove something about their family dynamics that everyone in the room knew wasn't quite true. My life had found a rhythm over the past few years that felt sustainable, even peaceful. Monday through Friday, I'd drive my Honda Accord the 15 minutes from downtown to the Domain area, where TechFlow Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office building. I loved my work in a way that sometimes surprised people. There was something deeply satisfying about building elegant solutions to complex problems, about writing code that would make someone's day a little easier, or help a business run more smoothly. Marcus Thompson, my boss and the closest thing I had to a mentor, had pulled me aside just the week before to discuss a promotion opportunity. TechFlow was expanding their enterprise solutions division, and they wanted someone to lead a team of 8 developers on a project that could potentially double my salary within 2 years. The conversation had taken place in Marcus's corner office, with its view of the Austin skyline and its walls lined with awards from various tech industry organizations. You've got the technical skills, obviously, Marcus had said, leaning back in his chair with that easy confidence that came from someone who'd built a successful company from scratch. But more than that, you've got something that's harder to teach. You understand that technology is really about people. You build solutions that humans can actually use. The promotion would mean more responsibility, longer hours, and significantly more money. It would also mean making some decisions about what I wanted my life to look like going forward. More money meant I could easily continue supporting my parents indefinitely, could probably even increase what I was contributing without feeling any real financial strain. But it also meant acknowledging that this arrangement might become permanent, that I might spend the next decade or more subsidizing a lifestyle for people who seem to view my contributions as an obligation rather than a gift. Emma and I had talked about the future more seriously lately, not in any pressure-filled way, but in the natural progression of two people who'd been together for over a year and were genuinely happy with each other. We'd started looking at houses, just casually browsing open houses on weekend afternoons. When we had nothing else planned, Austin's real estate market was competitive, but with our combined incomes, we could afford something really nice. Maybe something with a yard, where we could host our own gatherings, our own version of family that didn't come with decades of resentment and financial manipulation. The routine I'd built felt good, felt healthy. Weekday mornings started with a run around the lake, followed by coffee and a quick scan of tech news before heading to the office. Work was engaging, without being overwhelming, the kind of intellectual challenge that left me feeling accomplished rather than drained. Evenings usually meant cooking dinner while listening to podcasts, maybe catching up with Emma over video call if she was traveling for work, or meeting friends for drinks if anyone was free. Weekends were for exploration. Austin had this incredible food scene that Emma and I had made it our mission to fully experience. We discovered hole-in-the-wall taco places in East Austin, upscale farm-to-table restaurants in the Hill Country, food trucks that served better barbacoa than most established restaurants. We'd become regulars at the Saturday morning farmers market, where we'd buy whatever looked interesting and then spend Sunday afternoon experimenting with new recipes. It was a good life, a life I'd built deliberately and thoughtfully. The monthly payments to my parents were significant, but they weren't breaking me financially. My own expenses were modest compared to my income. I'd grown up with parents who lived paycheck to paycheck despite decent middle-class jobs. And I'd learned early that financial security was something you built slowly and carefully. My savings account was healthy. My retirement contributions were maxed out. And I still had plenty left over for the lifestyle I wanted. The arrangement with my parents had started 3 years ago when they'd called in a panic about potentially losing the house. Tom's construction company had gone under during a particularly brutal economic downturn, and Linda's teacher's pension wasn't enough to cover their mortgage payments. They'd made some questionable financial decisions during the good years refinancing, multiple times to fund home improvements and vacations they couldn't really afford. When they'd first asked for help, it had felt like a temporary solution. Tom was confident he'd find another job quickly, maybe even start his own contracting business with a partner he'd been talking to for months. The house payments would just be a bridge, a few months of assistance while they got back on their feet. 3 years later, Tom's business plans had evaporated into a series of vague schemes that never quite materialized. Linda had embraced retirement, with an enthusiasm that seemed to increase in direct proportion to the amount of money I was contributing to their household budget. And Brittany had moved into their garage apartment with Derek, creating a multi-generational support system that apparently ran entirely on my income. But even that morning, even knowing all of that, I'd felt optimistic about the family gathering. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today would be the day Tom announced he'd finally found steady work. Or Brittany mentioned a job interview, or someone would acknowledge that this arrangement was temporary and express some genuine gratitude for the help I'd been providing. I'd been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I'd never been more completely, devastatingly wrong about anything than I was about that afternoon. The pattern had started so gradually that I'd barely noticed it happening. Looking back now, I can see how masterfully they'd orchestrated the whole thing. how each small request had built upon the last, until I'd become completely trapped in a web of financial obligation and emotional blackmail. But at the time, each individual ask had seemed reasonable, even noble. After all, what kind of son wouldn't help his parents in their time of need? It began with the mortgage payments, of course. That first panicked phone call from Linda in late 2021, her voice trembling with what I'd believed was genuine desperation. Tom's construction business had collapsed virtually overnight when 3 major clients defaulted on their payments, leaving him with a mountain of unpaid invoices and no way to cover his own expenses. Linda had painted a picture of impending homelessness, of 2 people in their late 50s facing the prospect of losing everything they'd worked for their entire lives. "We don't know where else to turn, Ryan," she'd said, her voice breaking in that particular way that had always been my weakness. "The bank is already threatening foreclosure. We've tried everything, looked into refinancing, talked to credit counselors, but nothing's working. We're going to lose the house unless we can catch up on the payments." The amount they needed. It seemed manageable at first. Just enough to bring their mortgage current, maybe 3 or 4 months of payments while Tom figured out his next move. I'd agreed without much hesitation, transferring $15,000 that same afternoon. It felt good, actually, being able to solve their problems so easily. Felt like what success was supposed to be for, taking care of the people who'd taken care of you. Since somehow, 3 or 4 months had turned into 6 months, then a year. Then an indefinite arrangement that nobody ever formally acknowledged, but everyone simply accepted. Tom's job search had been plagued by what Linda described as age discrimination, though I'd started to notice that his definition of suitable employment had become increasingly narrow over time. Construction work was too physically demanding. For someone his age, contracting required startup capital they didn't have. Management positions were either beneath his experience level or required qualifications he didn't possess. By the 6-month mark, the conversation had shifted in subtle but significant ways. It was no longer about temporary assistance while they got back on their feet. Instead, Linda had begun framing my contributions in terms of family obligation and long-term investment. "You're not just helping us," she'd explained during our monthly check-ins. "You're protecting your inheritance. This house is going to be yours and Brittany's someday anyway. You're really just paying your own mortgage early." The logic had seemed sound enough at the time, even though something about it had made me vaguely uncomfortable. Emma had been the first to point out the fundamental flaw in their reasoning. "If this house is supposed to be your inheritance," she'd asked over dinner one evening, "why are you the only one paying for it? Where's Brittany's contribution to preserving her future inheritance?" That question had bothered me more than I'd wanted to admit, but when I'd raised it with Linda, she'd had an answer ready. "Brittany's situation is different, honey. She and Derek are just starting out. They're trying to build their own life together. You're established, you've got that good job, and no real responsibilities. Just makes sense for you to carry more of the load right now." The "no real responsibilities" comment had stung, but I'd let it slide. After all, it was technically true that I didn't have a mortgage or kids or any of the major financial obligations that typically defined adult life. What Linda hadn't acknowledged was that this wasn't an accident. I'd deliberately chosen to rent instead of buy, to focus on my career instead of starting a family, precisely because I'd wanted the flexibility to help when situations like this arose. But flexibility, I was learning, could become its own kind of prison. The requests had multiplied gradually. First it was just the mortgage, then it was the property taxes when those came due. "We can't afford to lose the house over a tax bill," Tom had explained, as if this were some unforeseeable crisis rather than an annual obligation that every homeowner planned for. Then it was homeowners insurance, then utilities, then grocery bills, when Linda's teacher's pension apparently wasn't stretching far enough to cover basic living expenses. Each new request came with its own elaborate justification, its own emotional appeal designed to make me feel guilty for even hesitating. When I'd questioned the grocery bills, Linda had launched into a detailed explanation of how inflation was killing people on fixed incomes, how she was already buying generic brands and clipping coupons, but it still wasn't enough. When I'd suggested that maybe they should consider downsizing to something more affordable, Tom had exploded with indignation about how they'd worked their whole lives to earn the right to age in place. How it was unreasonable to expect them to give up their home, just because the economy had dealt them a bad hand. Brittany's presence in the garage apartment had added another layer of complexity to the whole arrangement. She'd moved in supposedly temporarily after her own financial setbacks, bringing Derek along as part of the package deal. Derek had been laid off from his job at a local marketing firm and was supposedly looking for work, though his job search seemed to consist primarily of scrolling through LinkedIn, while complaining about how employers these days expected too much for too little money. Neither Brittany nor Derek contributed anything to the household expenses that I was covering, but Linda had made it clear that any suggestion of rent or utility contributions from them was completely out of bounds. Their family, she'd said, when I'd carefully broached the subject, we don't charge family rent. Besides, they're already helping out so much around the house. It's doing yard work and maintenance that we couldn't afford to hire someone for. The yard work and maintenance mostly consisted of Derek occasionally mowing the lawn and Brittany organizing Linda's closets. Tasks that seemed to justify their complete exemption from any financial responsibility while simultaneously reinforcing my obligation to cover increasingly elaborate expenses. When the air conditioning unit needed replacing, I'd found myself writing a check for $8,000. When the roof developed a leak, another $6,000. When Linda decided the kitchen needed updating because the appliances were embarrassingly outdated, I'd somehow become responsible for a $15,000 renovation that I'd never been consulted about until the bills arrived. The manipulation had become increasingly sophisticated over time. Linda had developed an arsenal of emotional weapons that she deployed with surgical precision whenever I showed signs of resistance. There was the martyrdom approach, where she'd talk about how she and Tom were sacrificing their own comfort and dignity by accepting help from their children. There was the guilt trip, where she'd remind me of all the sacrifices they'd made to pay for my education and support my early career. There was the future fear tactic, where she'd paint vivid pictures of what would happen to them if I ever stopped helping, how they'd end up homeless and destitute in their old age. But perhaps most effective was the comparison game she'd perfected, where she'd hold up other families as examples of proper filial devotion. The Hendersons' son bought them a new car last Christmas. She'd mentioned casually during family dinners, and you know the Patels down the street? Their daughter sends them on a cruise every year. She says it's the least she can do after everything they did for her. The implication was always clear. Good children took care of their parents, and the quality of that care was a direct reflection of the child's character and gratitude. Any reluctance to provide whatever was being requested wasn't just financial anxiety or practical concern. It was moral failure, a fundamental deficiency in my understanding of family loyalty and basic human decency. Emma had watched this pattern develop with increasing alarm and frustration. She'd tried to point out the obvious problems with the arrangement, how my parents seemed to be treating me like a personal ATM rather than a son, how their financial planning appeared to consist entirely of assuming I'd cover whatever they couldn't afford. But her observations had made me defensive in ways that I now realize were completely irrational. You don't understand family dynamics, I'd told her after one particularly pointed conversation about my parents' spending habits. They're not taking advantage of me, they're just going through a rough patch. This isn't going to last forever. But 3 years later, the rough patch had become the new normal. My parents had settled into a lifestyle that assumed my continued financial support as a permanent feature, rather than temporary assistance. They'd stopped looking for ways to reduce their expenses or increase their income. Instead, they'd started looking for ways to justify increasing my contributions. The breaking point should have come months earlier, but I'd been too invested in the fiction that this was all temporary, too committed to the belief that being a good son meant never saying no to a request for help, no matter how unreasonable or poorly justified it might be. The barbecue that Saturday afternoon started, like every other family gathering I'd attended over the past 3 years, with Linda orchestrating every detail like a theater director staging a performance about domestic bliss. She'd spent the morning arranging and rearranging the patio furniture, adjusting the umbrella angles to provide optimal shade, and setting up what she called her entertaining station with military precision. Everything had to be perfect for these gatherings. She'd explained to me countless times. Because family was precious, and these moments together were what really mattered in life. What I hadn't understood until that day was that I wasn't a guest at these performances. I was a prop. The first hint should have been Linda's outfit. She was wearing a new sundress that I'd never seen before. Something expensive looking with a designer label that caught the light when she moved. Her hair had been professionally styled that morning, and she was wearing jewelry that definitely hadn't come from her usual department store haunts. When I'd complimented her appearance, she'd waved off the praise with false modesty, claiming she'd just thrown something together. But I'd caught her checking her reflection in the sliding glass door multiple times throughout the afternoon. Tom had fired up the massive gas grill that had appeared in their backyard sometime over the winter. A top-of-the-line model with more gauges and controls than my car dashboard. When I'd asked about it, he'd launched into an enthusiastic explanation of its various features, how it could smoke, sear, and slow cook with restaurant-quality precision. The price tag, he'd mentioned casually, had been steep, but worth it for someone who took grilling as seriously as he did. Neither of them had jobs. Neither of them had any source of income beyond Linda's modest teacher's pension. Living like people who'd never heard the word budget, and I was just beginning to understand where the money for this lifestyle was really coming from. Brittany and Derek had emerged from the garage apartment around noon, looking like they'd just rolled out of bed despite the fact that it was well past lunchtime. Brittany was sporting a fresh manicure and what appeared to be new highlights in her hair, while Derek was wearing brand-name athletic wear that still had creases from the packaging. They'd both been to the gym that morning, they'd announced. At the upscale fitness center that had opened recently in the shopping complex near my parents' neighborhood. "So nice to finally have a decent place to work out," Brittany had said, stretching languidly in one of the patio chairs. "The membership fees are a little steep, but you can't put a price on your health, right?" I'd nodded along automatically, but something about the comment had lodged in my brain like a splinter. Membership fees. For people who supposedly couldn't afford rent, or groceries, or any contribution to the household expenses I'd been covering. The math wasn't adding up, but I'd pushed the thought away, not ready to examine what it might mean. The conversation throughout the afternoon had followed familiar patterns, with Linda playing the role of devoted mother, gathering her successful children around her table, and Tom holding court as the family patriarch, dispensing wisdom about life and work and the importance of family bonds. But there was something different about their performance that day. It's an edge of smugness that I'd never noticed before, as if they were sharing some private joke that I wasn't in on. Derek had spent a good portion of the afternoon complaining about his job search, but his complaints had taken on a strange quality that I couldn't quite identify at first. He wasn't frustrated about being unemployed, I realized. He was offended by the jobs that were available to him. The salary ranges were insulting. The benefits packages were inadequate. The work environments weren't up to his standards. He talked about potential employers like they were supplicants, seeking his approval rather than companies he was hoping would hire him. "I had this interview last week," he'd said, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis, "and they wanted me to start at the bottom, work my way up, prove myself all over again." I told them, "Look, I've got experience, I've got skills. I'm not some college kid who needs training wheels. Either you respect what I bring to the table, or we're wasting each other's time." Brittany had nodded along supportively, adding her own commentary about how employers these days didn't appreciate quality candidates. They expected people to be grateful for substandard opportunities. The irony of this conversation happening on the patio that I was paying for, while they drank beer that I'd indirectly purchased, was apparently lost on everyone except me. But it was the conversation about vacation plans that finally opened my eyes to what was really happening. Linda had been talking about a cruise she and Tom were considering for their upcoming anniversary, a 2-week Mediterranean voyage that she'd been researching online. She'd pulled out her phone to show me pictures of the ship, the ports of call, the various excursion options that were available. The enthusiasm in her voice was infectious, and for a moment I'd found myself genuinely happy that they were planning something special for themselves. "It's going to be expensive," she'd said with a theatrical sigh, but we've been talking about it for years. Life's too short to keep putting off your dreams. Besides, we deserve this after everything we've been through." Tom had nodded along, adding details about the upgrade to a balcony cabin they were considering, the specialty dining packages that would let them experience all the ship's restaurants, the shore excursions that would make each port stop really memorable. They'd talked about it like people who'd already made the decision to book, not like people who were still in the dreaming phase. "How much is something like that?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about the financial planning that would make such a trip possible for people on their limited income. The look that passed between my parents in that moment was brief, but I caught it. It was the look of people who'd been caught off guard by a question they should have been prepared for, but weren't. Linda's smile had flickered for just a second, before she'd recovered with a laugh. "Oh, you know how these things are," she'd said vaguely. "You find ways to make it work when it's something that's really important to you." But Brittany, either oblivious to the undercurrent of the conversation or simply unable to resist showing off, had jumped in with specific details that made my blood run cold. "Mom showed me the brochures last week," she'd said excitedly. "Balcony suite is gorgeous, and the dining package includes that chef's table experience that's supposed to be incredible. Plus, they're doing the extended cruise that includes Greece and Turkey, not just the basic 7-day one. It's going to be amazing." I'd looked up cruise prices on my phone right there at the table, while the conversation continued around me. Extended Mediterranean cruises with balcony suites and dining packages for couples started at around $8,000 and went up from there. Way up. For people who supposedly couldn't afford their mortgage payment without my help, they were planning a vacation that cost more than most people made in months. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't temporary assistance during a rough patch. This wasn't a family coming together to help parents who'd fallen on hard times. This was a carefully orchestrated system of financial support that had allowed my parents to maintain and even upgrade their lifestyle while I covered all their basic expenses. Every dollar I sent them for necessities was a dollar they could spend on luxuries. I'd sat there in stunned silence, watching my family laugh and plan and dream about experiences they were funding with my labor, my sacrifice, my assumption that I was helping people who had no other options. The garage apartment that Brittany and Derek occupied rent-free wasn't emergency housing for a couple going through a rough patch. It was subsidized living that allowed them to spend their limited income on gym memberships and spa treatments and whatever else caught their fancy. The conversation had continued around me, but I'd stopped participating. Instead, I'd started adding up numbers in my head, calculating exactly how much money I'd transferred to this household over the past 3 years. The mortgage payments alone came to over $150,000. Add in the property taxes, insurance, utilities, the appliance replacements, the roof repair, the kitchen renovation, and countless other expenses that had somehow become my responsibility, and I was looking at close to $200,000. $200,000 that had allowed for adults to live comfortably without working, to plan luxury vacations, to shop for designer clothes and expensive gym memberships, to eat restaurant-quality barbecue cooked on premium equipment, while complaining about how hard their lives were and how disappointed they were in my level of support. The betrayal was so complete, so breathtaking in its scope and cynicism, that for a moment I'd wondered if I was misunderstanding something fundamental about the situation. But as I'd watched Linda show off photos of cruise ship amenities and listened to Tom explain the technical specifications of his grill, the truth had become impossible to ignore. I wasn't helping my family through a crisis. I was subsidizing their retirement while they performed elaborate theater about gratitude and temporary hardship. And worst of all, they'd convinced themselves that this arrangement wasn't just acceptable, but that I was somehow failing in my duties as a son by not providing even more. That's when Tom had made his speech about real sons and disappointment, and everything had finally crystallized into perfect, devastating clarity. The drive home from that barbecue was the longest 15 minutes of my life. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the full weight of 3 years of manipulation, crashing down on me like a collapsing building. Every red light gave me more time to think, to process what I'd just witnessed, to understand that my parents hadn't just taken advantage of my generosity, they'd turned it into a business model. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in, The parking garage for 20 minutes, my phone in my hands, staring at my banking app. The automatic transfer for next month's mortgage payment was scheduled to process in 5 days. Another $4,200 disappearing into their cruise fund while they called me a disappointment. Matt called while I was sitting there, her voice bright. With weekend energy? "How was the family barbecue?" she asked, and something in my silence must have told her everything she needed to know. "Ryan, what happened?" I told her everything. The cruise plans, the expensive grill, the gym memberships, the designer clothes, and finally, the speech about real sons and disappointment. When I finished, the silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Cancel the payments," she said finally, her voice steel. "Right now, while you're sitting there. Cancel every single automatic transfer." My finger hovered over the screen. 3 years of conditioning told me I was about to become the villain. In my family's story, the ungrateful son who abandoned his parents in their time of need. But the numbers didn't lie. The cruise brochures didn't lie. Their smug satisfaction while planning luxury vacations on my dime didn't lie. Canceled the mortgage payment first, then the utilities, then the insurance. Each tap felt like breaking chains I hadn't even realized were wrapped around my wrists. The confirmation emails arrived instantly, clinical and final. The phone call started the next morning. Tom first, his voice a mixture of confusion and rage. "The bank called," he said without preamble. He said the mortgage payment was declined. "Must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I canceled it. The explosion of anger that followed was everything I'd feared and nothing I couldn't handle. He called me selfish, ungrateful, a failure as a son, he threatened. To cut me out of the family, to tell everyone what kind of person I really was. When the threats didn't work, Linda got on the phone with tears and guilt trips. Painting pictures of homelessness and destitution. "We'll lose everything," she sobbed. "How could you do this to us?" "The same way you could plan a Mediterranean cruise while telling me I'm not doing enough," I replied, and hung up. Brittany tried a different approach, showing up at my office. 3 days later, with Derek in tow, they'd driven her car, I noticed, a newer model I'd never seen before. She attempted to play mediator, suggesting family counseling, compromise, some kind of middle ground where everyone could be happy. "You can't just abandon family," she pleaded in the lobby of my building, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "We need you. You need my money," I corrected. "There's a difference." The legal consultation with attorney Jennifer Hayes the following week confirmed what I'd already suspected. I had no obligation to continue supporting adults who were perfectly capable of working. My parents' threats about cutting me out of inheritances were empty, since they owned nothing that wasn't mortgaged to the hilt. The house they'd claimed was my future inheritance was worth exactly what they owed on it, maybe less in the current market. 6 months later, I got a wedding invitation in the mail. Emma and I had been engaged for 3 months by then, planning our own future in a house we'd purchased together with our combined savings. The invitation was for Brittany's renewal ceremony, apparently a second wedding to celebrate her marriage surviving its 4th anniversary. I threw it away without opening it. Emma found me that evening sitting on our new deck, watching the sunset over our small but perfect backyard. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. I thought about the automatic transfers that no longer depleted my account each month, about the cruise photos Linda had posted on social media funded by credit cards that weren't my responsibility, about the peace that came from building a life based on honesty instead of manipulation. "Not one," I said, and meant it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.